Today we're going to create realistic shadows with cutout images. And this is so important to master as a designer because you're always constantly cutting out images and putting them on backgrounds that aren't their native background. So you have to be able to manually create shadows that look realistic, so it doesn't look like that object is from another photo. So I just opened up a plain document, and rarely do you see a photo on top of a stark white background. So we're just going to create a really subtle gray background. I'm just going to go ahead and get the paint bucket tool and do a very light gray on a new layer. So this is a very, very light gray, and I'm just going to use my burn and my dodge tools to just create a little bit of a dynamic background. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. This is the burn tool. Put it on midtones and just a little bit of exposure. So you can see I'm just darkening corners and just making it more of not a flat background. And I want to add a tiny bit of texture to it, so I'm just going to go up and add a little bit of a grain texture. So let me go up and do that. Add a little bit noise. So noise, add noise, and I'm just going to do a little tiny bit of noise makes a big difference. So when we zoom into our canvas, you can see it's a little bit more textured, and it's not just a stark white background. And so now we're ready to begin with our first object. So I have a coffee cup I cut out from another image. So let me go ahead and load that coffee cup in here. So there he is. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can see our shadows a little better. So this is without any shadows. It already looks better because there's a nice textured, realistic background. So there's a couple ways we could go about this. The quickest way to do this is to just duplicate this layer. So layer, duplicate layer. And I'm going to go to my Layer Styles panel, and I'm going to just do a color overlay and do maybe a light, very, very light gray, just to show enough contrast between the background and this layer. And I'm going to move this. Let me get my Layers panel out here so you can see my layers a little bit. And some of these layers I do not need. So I'm going to drag this behind our coffee layer, and I'm going to do this main coffee. And let's do this shadow just so we don't lose track of our layers. And the quickest way to do this, and this is kind of the big trick to creating realistic shadows, is understanding how shadows work and understanding where the original light source is. So if the original light source is straight top down, you're going to have an even shadow all the way around the coffee cup, which is easy because we have this image created right here. So I'm going to go, and this is a straight edge. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see a shadow that goes all the way around the coffee cup. And we need to blur this because shadows are usually blurred a little bit when they're cast. They're not just a straight edge. So let's blur this a little bit by going to Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I just do a little bit of Gaussian Blur. I could do a preview to see if I like it. That's probably enough. So there's kind of your quick realistic shadow. If the light source was coming straight down on top of the coffee cup, it would cast an equal shadow all the way around the piece. But one of my favorite things to do to make it even more realistic, and we can actually darken that that shadow just a little bit. You don't want it so light that you can't even make out the shadow. So maybe like that. But I like to manually create shadows with using the paintbrush tool and the eraser tool to kind of create and craft my own custom shadow. So let's play around with a couple of different light sources so that we can see how we can manipulate this a little bit and create a custom shadow. So I'm going to create a brand new layer, and this is going to be our shadow layer. And I'm going to go ahead and delete the old shadow layer that we had. So I have our shadow layer right here. We probably don't need some of these layers, so we can delete that. So let's go ahead and grab our paintbrush tool, our brush tool. And I'm going to get the soft feathered brush, so you can pick any of the feathered ones. This is the straight edge and this is the feather. The feather has a more realistic look for shadows. Right now I'm doing 100% opacity, and I can change my brush color. Let's do a dark gray, just so we can really make out our shadow. It's not going to stay that dark gray, but we can at least see it. So let's begin to draw. Let's pretend the light source is coming a little bit from this side. And so it's going to cast a shadow down here. So the shadow is going to be the opposite of your light source. So let's go ahead and just draw, and let's go ahead and move this behind our coffee cup. And let's create where we think the shadows will be. We can always use the eraser tool. And I like to do a little bit of the edges around it, kind of gives it more dimension. We can always carve it out later. So let's reduce the opacity to create a realistic shadow that's too dark. We're just going to eyeball it, and I like to do very subtle hints. So that is probably all you need. I just did an 11%. So just a little bit of contrast so you can see the shadow. So now we can take our eraser tool and we can start to trim our shadow back a little bit. So let's grab our eraser tool and just kind of trim back. Right now I have it on 100% opacity. This is the eraser tool. So I'm erasing 100% of what you're seeing. I may not need as much shadow over here. And another cool thing you can do is you can feather this as well using the eraser tool. So I can do a straight delete like that, or I can reduce the opacity by 50%, and I go around the edges. So let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see. So I have this at 45%, let's just do 50 to round it up. And this helps to feather the deletion. So it'll just delete the outside of it. And this makes the drop shadow look more feathered and blended. And I might need to edit this cup because this color is kind of disappearing. This little, the white cream and the dark background there, I can't really see that. So I'm taking the coffee cup. Let me grab my burn tool. Let me make it a much smaller brush than that. Let me just add a little bit of, I might need to change it to highlights. I'm just adding a little bit of shadow there. Okay, so let's zoom back out. Zoom back in. Okay, so that is one way to create a shadow. And what's great about this is our shadow layer. I'm going to take our brush tool and modify it again. So let me grab our brush tool right up here. I'm just going to paint a little bit. Maybe I just need a little bit more over here. Take our eraser tool. Just continue to play around with where you think the shadow would drop. So maybe it doesn't need to have any shadows over here. You know, the light source could be coming from this direction. Or I could just have a little shadow, so I can do a 50% erase and just kind of still keep a tiny bit of gray there. Just going back, maybe adding a deeper shadow. Maybe it's casting, maybe the angle of the sun is lower on the horizon and it's casting a much longer, deeper shadow. That's a possibility. And so we need to probably get our 100% eraser tool. Maybe make our brush bigger. It'll have a more feathered, softer erase. Just like that. So let's try a different angle. So let's assume the light source is coming from this direction. So I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm going to grab our brush tool. I'm going to do the same thing. The handle is not going to cast a shadow, I don't believe, or maybe it could right down here. But maybe it's evening and it's casting a big wide shadow. I could probably just make the brush bigger and make that a little smoother. And it's going to be, this is a pretty nice circular shape, so it's going to cast a shadow that's nice and circular too. And let's go ahead and delete. Let's not do anything with the handle right now. And maybe the handle, maybe you see it right here come out. It's casting down. The light source is coming from this direction. So let's reduce the opacity on this just a little bit, maybe even a little more. And let's feather this a little bit. So let's I have the eraser tool on 50%. I'm just going around the outer edge to delete just a little bit around it. Oops, I'm doing the wrong layer, aren't I? Let's go back in my history. Let's do my shadow layer. There we go. Just blending it, making it softer and smooth. So look how subtle that shadow is. We could even make it a little bit more apparent, just like this. And maybe that handle doesn't seem quite right, so I'm just going to delete a little bit of that and redraw it. So this is very simple to to test and manipulate your shadows. And maybe it casts right there. And let's get the eraser tool and kind of fade it a little bit. So there's kind of a pretty realistic shadow. We can go back, create a new layer, and I'm just going to maybe do a really deep shadow at the beginning of that. Come back with the eraser tool, soften it. And so you see how we're creating layers with the shadows. There's a dark layer, and as you move out it gets softer and more feathered. So let's screen this back a little bit. So that makes it even more realistic in my opinion. And you'll notice the little waves in this cup too. So if you really wanted to get detailed, I can take this layer, the darker layer we just did, make a small brush, make it 100% opacity, and you can actually cut out little grooves to make it look like the waves are being cut out. But these are very subtle, so I don't think I need to do too much. Just a little bit of, if you're talking about trying to be as realistic as possible. So there we go. That's pretty good shadow. I could probably feather this and do more details, but just for the sake of time, kind of showing you some basics here of shadows. I think we're pretty good. Let me toggle my layer. I got 2 shadow layers. There we go. That looks a little better. Let me go back. So the light source would be coming here. It's cast long and deep because maybe the sun is more on the horizon. Maybe it's the evening. And the closer the shadow is to the cup, the higher the sun will be in the position, or the light source, the higher on top the light source would be. So there's our coffee cup. We're going to try something a little more challenging with our next object.